introduce myself first. I'm Yola Maddock-Jones, and I'm Professor of Criminal Justice here at Wrexham University. And I have the honour of introducing the speaker tonight. Before I do, just a couple of housekeeping points. We don't have a fire drill planned. So if you hear it go off, it's serious and it's real. So just follow me, because I'll be pretty quick. And there's the door. So just follow my footsteps towards the fire exit, or follow whatever instructions that you might be given. Unless Wulf's Welsh language skills have improved dramatically over the last month, not by the looks of it, then this is going to be an English language lecture, peppered with some Welsh, I'm sure, as usual. But I'm a siaradwr Cymraeg, I'm a Welsh speaker. If anybody wants to make a contribution in the Welsh language, I'm here to facilitate that in any way that I can. So os oes rhywun eisiau gwneud cyfraniad yn Gymraeg, mae goeswch chi wneud hynna a mi wna I gyfieithu iddo chi. Okay, so there's a lot of you here. I thought that the title Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll was a bit of a marketing masterstroke, really, wasn't it? To get people in here. But I'm afraid if you came expecting any of that, you've been missold. We will be having some intercourse, but only in the form of a lecture. Wulf hasn't bought his guitar, so we're going to be spared his rock and roll. And the only thing he's going to be supplying us with is wisdom over the course of the next hour. Okay, so I'm here to introduce Wulf, and he is a leading figure in the field of alcohol studies, whose work bridges research policy and frontline delivery issues. A qualified social worker by background, who's worked quite a lot in the probation service, Wulf has spent the last, shall we say 2 decades, not 3 decades working and examining how alcohol, other drugs and mental health intersect with systems of care, with a particular focus on policy evaluation and the lived realities of service provision. Okay, his research, grounded mostly in qualitative and participatory methodologies, has seen him work across Wales, Scotland, England, and into the wider European context as well, where he's made a significant contribution in the field through his work, particularly on minimum unit pricing and government alcohol and drug policy. And those have been shown in his breadth of publication and his scholarship and editorial leadership activities as well. Alongside his academic work, Wulf remains deeply connected to practice communities in North Wales, and I know that he is both a trustee and a trusted advisor to a range of organisations and people who work in the wider Wales recovery community. So Wulf joined Wrexham in 2010 and has made an enormous contribution also to the research community in the university, both by mentoring others, by co-writing papers, undertaking research with others, but also by being director of Cyfiawnder, which is the social inclusion research unit here at the university. So in today's lecture, Wulf will reflect on the evolution of his work from early beginnings to more critical methodological approaches. And through personal stories and professional reflections, he will challenge dominant narratives around alcohol and drug use and highlight the marginalisation of lived experience, and probably cast quite a critical eye, I think, on current alcohol and drug policies. So join me in welcoming Wulf Livingston.
So thank you ever so much, Yola. It's a real pleasure, a real warm welcome. It's fantastic to see a room full of, I think, friendly faces and people I know, but some people I don't know as well, so really welcome. It's always nice to see people at public lectures. You're absolutely right, it's a marketing scheme. So when we put in, when I was asked to encourage to make an expression to do a talk before I retire, I jokingly just shoved the title in, thinking that'll put them off, they won't want me to do it, and actually the opposite happened at all. But I'm going to try and scatter it where I can and try and make sense of it all in terms of both sex, drugs and rock and roll, because they're an important part of what I've been doing. I actually also did the first in this series. So we've been doing public research talks for a little while, and Luke was here for the first one, so lovely to see you here again. And it's been nice to see the evolution. I have to say, when we did the first ones, we were in a much smaller room than this, with a lot less chairs and a lot less people. So that was just absolutely fantastic. Okay, so... Oh, it's down, isn't it? Sorry. Away we go. So this is a different talk. So anyone that's attended the research series before, we've almost always had someone come up and they've talked and they've presented a particular piece of research they're doing, a particular piece of research they've finished. And as Yola said, this is actually a talk in which I'm going to try and take a journey. And it's definitely not a single topic. It's an accumulation of bits. And those people who know me really well and have ever left me a message on my phone will know stuff is one of my favourite words. So I'm going to just talk about some stuff. I don't feel it needs to be any more glorious than that. Stuff that's put me on my journey, stuff that shaped me, stuff I think, perhaps stuff I've learnt, or I should say, and it will be clear at the end, that I'm probably still learning, because I don't think we ever stop learning. And I'm going to try and do that. It is obviously a research talk. It's in our research. It will be about research, and it will be about alcohol and drugs. So those are the lenses, but they're just stuff. And there will be a lot of personal things going on. I very much need to start first with some thanks, and there are a lot of thanks. And I'm used to talking to people, and I don't normally have too much anxiety or nerves. But I haven't talked with my family in the room before, and that definitely adds a layer of criticality that I'm going to be exposed to over the Sunday table for a few weeks to come. So no pressure there, yes, but thank you to them, because I don't do anything without their particular support. There are a lot of my colleagues in here, colleagues I've worked with closely, particularly colleagues from social work and criminology who have been immensely important to me on journey, colleagues from the research office which have been great, and then one or two wider colleagues who I've had the privilege of working with, particularly like Katie here from South Wales, and sneaking in the back the legend that is Mr. Trevor McCarthy, who I've had a real pleasure of working with for many, many years. You're welcome, Trevor. Yes, lovely to see you here. I've had some mentors, and Trevor is definitely one of those, so it's great to see him in the room. And it's really nice, and I have to acknowledge everything I've done is shaped by other people. I think in academia, all we do is recycle stuff. It's really rare to claim originality. If you get an apple that falls on your head, you might claim a bit of originality, but most of us are just living on the backs of others, if not recycling our own work. Yes? But of course, none of this is actually, and the people that deserve more thanks than anyone else, are the people that I've either taken copious quantities of drink and drugs with, because I've learned so much through that particular part of the experience, or those people that have had the pleasure, I've had the pleasure of listening to their stories about their own drink or drug use, or those that I've had the pleasure of supporting in the recovery community. So I want to go right back to the beginnings, because I'm a firm believer that I don't really believe in the idea that the researcher or the scientist can be wholly objective. We can't escape the self. We give that a really fancy word in research. I think we call that positionality, but it's really you just can't escape yourself. I can't escape myself, and given that I've ended up doing practice in alcohol and drugs, I can't escape the role that alcohol and drugs have played in my life. So I thought I'd start there, really. And they start at the beginning. I chose this picture on the right-hand side because I've been reflecting over the last 2 or 3 years that I'm actually a Guinness baby. And for those who don't know, there are people who were born in hospitals when the trolley came round with Guinness. And it was given to women for iron, and so I was a state-sponsored consumer of alcohol before I was even born. So these things shape who we are, and I've continued to have alcohol and drugs as a significant part of my life permanently now for 63 years. I can't escape that. That shapes the way I think, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in terms of models later. That migrated from being an observer at family parties or an occasional participator, as many of us were when we could go round at weddings at the age of 5 and access the glasses that the adults held there, right through to by the time I was 13 or 14, and certainly 13 or 14, and my wife Mel is here, and she knew me through some of those phases, but certainly 13 or 14 till probably the other side of our marriage in fairly serious hedonistic, large consumptions of alcohol and drugs personally. And that migrated for me into my first working life. So before I became a social worker and before I became a researcher and academic, I was actually, like many people who can't be quite sure what to do, and that may even apply to my daughter Tilly at times, we hang around in kitchens in North Wales because it's a way of earning a living. And it's fun. It's a real buzz, and anyone that's spent any time, and I know Jason's here and he will have done this the same at all, you adopt this culture, and this culture is encapsulated by certainly one of my favourite books, favourite authors, and these are the rock and roll chefs, these guys. And when you read the book, they're all talking about the blasting of Ramones in the kitchen whilst they're doing the service, and then they finish service and they go out and do as much drink and drugs as they can and get up 3 hours later and start service again. That was my life, and that shaped some of my experiences. And that was really very exciting. They were incredibly formative and really important in the context of when I'm doing alcohol, drug policy stuff and practice stuff, where we often get focused on the problematic side of drink and drug use. I learned that drugs, alcohol and other drugs, can be fun. They help you and successfully escape. Yes, they have lots of useful functions. Yes, most women in labour would be quite happy to have the pethidine, the heroin. So they have functions. And they are highly culturally, like this image here, and environmentally bound. And I feel it's really important that we take that into our research. We don't have a sense of just leaving it behind and saying we can control everything, do some stuff, and then the stuff we do in this cold, sterile environment, we can put back into really people's complex lives. And I really don't believe in any of that. Okay, and then I went on to practice, and for those of you who don't know this picture, comes from a brilliant artist who was in Manchester. I certainly know Trevor have known Michael. Michael Linnell, he worked for an organisation which was really cutting edge, Lifeline, and I was very fortunate. I tried to get a job when I qualified as a social worker, and no one would employ me. And then I finally was being interviewed by essentially a street-based drug agency with a chief executive who had recovered from their own history of heroin use. And yeah, he said, oh yeah, you're the type we want, come and work. And despite my best attempts to avoid working with alcohol and drugs, I ended up working with alcohol and drugs, and I've been here ever since. And really the point to say is that perhaps the most formative experience that I've ever brought into my understanding of research is all of that time I spent as a practitioner in a room with people, talking to people, being given the privilege of understanding the way in which alcohol and drugs has impacted on their life, and just being able to be a little part of that journey where they make successful changes. And that's the place I learn, and that's the stuff that informs my research. And I don't think, again, we can take that out of the picture at all. What was that? Yeah, the crap model, yes. Well, so we'll come back to that. And then I started, as I became in practice, I obviously started to do little bits of reading here and there and things that shaped my influence. And there were two particular pieces of work early on that really got me really quite excited. So I've put this picture of Vietnam, and there's a text by a few books by someone called Robbins. And he did this fantastic piece of research, as far as I'm concerned, with Vietnam vets who all got addicted to heroin in the Vietnam War, yes? And they came back, and lo and behold, they didn't use heroin. Yeah? And it wasn't that the drug had turned them into addicts. They were using the drug in a particular situation, completely removed from the context. Something else went on. Yes? It doesn't mean that their lives were great, it doesn't mean that they didn't do a bit of drinking with their family or stuff, but the drug didn't travel with them from one completely different context to the other. And the other person that did some stuff at this time, and many of you may know, is Bruce Alexander, and it's a citation for his much later book there. But he did a very famous experiment people may know about, which has often been very reductionist, but he did an experiment called Rat Park. So he actually did what the traditional scientists did, and he put the rats in the cage, and where they used to be demonstrated with the old Pavlov's dog technique of... Pavlov's dog, by the way, most excellent 1970s rock band, yes? We'll get some rock and roll in here somewhere, yes? But they were doing the Pavlov dog's technique, and so he just put the rats in a much bigger house, gave the rats, women and boy rats, to have fun with, gave them toys and all sorts of stuff, and then they rejected the cocaine and just had the water. Yes? Really interesting stuff, and it made me think a lot. And essentially, many of my practice experiences and talking to people, this was one of the first models I developed about really understanding. And I've taken a lot of this into my understanding of research and my criticism of policy, and it gets ignored, and it really frustrates me. It's a poor model now. I wrote it a long time ago, but part of me is still proud about it, and I always find it a bit weird when I know that the local drug agency teaches this model to some people, so that's kind of quite funny. But essentially, I would hear people tell me, if I paraphrased it, they would say, my life is crap. It's full of it. That's their word, and they would say that. And they would tell me that the alcohol use does this obvious thing, yes? You know, they're still living in the crap life, but the alcohol use stops people experiencing it. They get away from it. But the prolonged and complicated and extended use of alcohol would just double the crap. Yes? And if all we ever did was look at models that only ever controlled the drugs, got rid of the drugs in that bit of their life, well, you can work out the simple mathematical equation, they're still left with the original crap. All those interventions do is ever reduce half. Yes? So what they actually wanted was something else. And actually what I've learned, and what I learned then, and what I still believe now, is that most people they're not so obsessed about the end goal of whether they are or not drinking. Now, many people who have done daily drinking for a very long time will probably only ever end out in an abstinence exit route. But actually what everyone wants is this. It's what we all want. Yeah, I could almost say it's what I'm going to get when I retire, but that would be a little bit unfair, yes? Okay, and then the other thing I took from practice, and I think this has become increasingly important, I was talking to someone earlier about this, this is a model that this was an obsessive piece of work that I did in my PhD. I tried to get it published twice, and it got rejected, and it was becoming an obsession. And I ended up self-publishing it, and I actually put at the top of the article, I need to get rid of this because otherwise I'm not going to move on in my life. It's been rejected in the academic world, but please feel free to look at it. And the criticism of the academics, I cut and paste and put at the bottom so people could see what they said. And I just got rid of it in my life, and it was incredibly freeing. But what I learned from all of those mixtures of the personal and professional and the practice and all the other bits and pieces was that we bring not only into our social work practice, but I've increasingly realised into research, and we might argue it in many other forms of life, we bring these elements and we operate in the middle of here in the way in which we practice. So my journey reflected some of that being their stuff. Yes, you know, I've done lots of drink and drugs, that's great. Familial experiences, and I've discussed some of those with you, but it could actually be that you have someone who works in the same field that brings you in that kind of journey and everything else. I have a huge passion, and I hope that will come throughout the day, and particularly I have a passion for wanting and helping and supporting people to get recovery. But actually, I only ever became a social worker because I got cheesed off with working in kitchens. I applied to be a nurse, they rejected it. Social work said yes. It wasn't necessarily my first choice, but it's the choice I ended up doing. Yeah. Probation decided my head office was moving to Cardiff, and there happened to be a job at Wrexham being advertised at the time. This stuff is opportunist, far more than we think it's planned, and then we build on the opportunity. And I think that's really important. And we do this in research as well. Yes? And one of the most opportunist moments I've ever had is with Katie in the room here. And Katie and I were both here at this university doing a PhD exam. Katie was the external, I was the internal. I happened to be jumping on the same train as Katie. We started chatting all the way down to Newport, and quote unquote, Katie said, "We should work together." And we have done, yes? Pure opportunism. Okay, moving a little bit more forward, I guess the research stuff. What are some of the things that have really shaped my mind? What's my understanding of research, where it's come from? And you're going to see I'm going to reference quite a few old books, and I think old books are really important. And I recommended to one of our PhD students a little while ago a 1950s book, Keywords by Raymond Williams, and it just reminded me today that I'd done that, and he said it was really valuable. So we can look at old books, and they're really good. So there's this book by William Foddy, and it was very transformative for me. It's this book about questions, yes? And I kind of paraphrased what I learnt from William Foddy. And when we begin to think about doing surveys or questionnaires or interviews or focus groups and think that we've got some control over it, and actually what we say back to people through a paper or a conference is what was actually out there, that's not true. Yes? The best example in our society more generally is that we wander down the street and we say to people, "How are you?" And we do not turn around to that person and go, "Look, I'm really fucked off, my life is shit." But we don't do any of that. We go, "Oh, I'm fine, how are you?" Yes? And the same thing happens in research interviews. The person is controlled in what they give to you. They only share what they want to share with you. You only hear that the way in which you hear it, and that's different to which someone else has heard it. Yes? And so on and so forth. So there's this lost in translation and then re-lost in presentation. And it becomes really kind of interesting. And the other thing that was really great, that William Foddy talks about this thing about, he makes this argument that attitudes don't exist. You don't have an attitude about something from a research point of view until someone comes and asks you the question about having that attitude. And the process of them asking you the question to think about that attitude is the point of time in which you form the attitude. So it's actually created and done by us. So these were really interesting stuff. And you'll begin to get this picture that the more of this stuff that influenced me, the harder I think it is that we can just kind of carve stuff off into this kind of weird space and say we can control everything and arrive at certain places. So another really important bit in this is the work of Jim Orford. And Jim Orford wrote this brilliant paper, and it's really well known to a lot of people in the drug and alcohol world, which is about asking the right question the right way. And it was at the time when we had two massive pieces of research in drug and alcohol world, a piece of research called Project Match and one called United Kingdom Alcohol Treatment Trial. And they essentially took 5 or 6 different types of interventions we might do with people, tried to control them, looked at the different groups, got to the end of that experiment and said, all the treatments have the same efficacy. Yeah, it's not about the treatment, and therefore he was just questioning us to say we need to start to look at something else. We need to look at the human bit that's going on in the process. Yes, which was really, really interesting. He talked about the everything being about short-term timescales, and I'm going to say something more about that. But one of the things I've realised is that we're supposed to be in a health and social care world in our research, and Caroline was talking about it earlier. We're interested in impact. We sometimes call that outcomes. Well, actually, the effect of impact and outcomes in terms of lots of health and social care interventions, and even if we think about it in terms of the distinction between people just sobering up from drug and alcohol use and then actually regaining a long-term recovery life, these outcomes are a long, long way down the line. Yes? So we never actually get there. We don't do enough longitudinal research. And broadly speaking, what happens, and another great colleague of the same group of ourselves, a guy called Robert Davidson, would talk about this, that really, the really good experimental research, what it does more than anything else is show that you're really good at experiments. Yeah? You will design it really well and it will deliver the result you intended to happen because you're really good at experiments. But what does it say beyond that? And Orford particularly, and this was the bit I was really interested in, I'm going to go on to talk about this, really said that researchers, particularly in this field of alcohol and drugs, but just more generally, need to embrace a greater variety of ways of accumulating knowledge. Yes? Yeah. And he really talked about, I think, a type of research having reached a dead end and a need for a shift. I don't think things have significantly shifted since then. I tried to articulate for a little bit of that shift. I'm going to articulate it for the rest of this talk, but I still think it doesn't. I've been in rooms relatively recently when other academics have said to me and my colleagues, you know that research you're doing, which is co-produced with people with lived-in experience, and you're talking to a small number of people, chatting in rooms, it's of no value. Give me big number scientific research I can do statistical analysis on. Yes, there is still a hierarchy floating around. We often use the expression glass ceiling in terms of wages and stuff. There is a glass ceiling about how people view what is really good science, and you will hear it called time and time again that the random control trial is the gold standard. I'm going to conclude and say I want some random control trials. I really want more medicines. I'm a diabetic. I quite like the idea that actually someone has tested those medicines before I take them. That's fine. I don't think they exist so much in this psychological social world. And one of the ways in which I've captured this, and one of the things that I really have got to an understanding, and this was about trying to capture professional, and it equally applies to researcher, attempting to catch some of the knowledge that influences the research process. I'm going to be really quick about this. It doesn't really matter about the detail. But really what we would talk about is this dominance of what we might call the codified knowledge. And I have some of that. I've got academic theory. I'm showing you some books and stuff. I've got 3 degrees. I've done a load of research. I know what the government policy. But that's not enough. When we're in a room, and this is me, this is the researcher, this is the social worker, when we're in the room, we're equally shaped by the stuff I've already said to you. We're shaped by life. We're shaped by our exposure to the topic. In this instance, it's alcohol and drugs, but it applies to all those topics. Each time we work with people, our previous work informs our next work. We recycle everything. And we shove all of this through our own personal value base. And that becomes 50% of what comes in the conversation. Yes? Yeah? The person who we're having the conversation with has an equal map. Yes, so those two things fuse together to start with, and then the very nature of the conversation then actually generates new knowledge there. It's not objective, that's exactly what's there. And it's really important that we don't overclaim that particular thing, yes? And sometimes I think the more codified is really important. And many of us in social work will know, and I've said this a long time, I've met class after class of social work students who I'm absolutely convinced understand more about alcohol through the case study of Phil Mitchell than they do anything that's occurred elsewhere. Yeah? And it's not even a bad portrayal. It's quite good. It's okay. We can pick faults on it, but, Okay, and then a couple of other little bits, and then we're going to talk about the research. There's a brilliant guy, no longer with us, John Booth Davis, a really good friend of mine, Trev's. He wrote this particular book, which is really, really challenging, The Myth of Addiction, and I learned a lot from that. And working for me with addiction is really complicated because I work in the recovery world. People own addiction works for them, they work in circles, all of that makes sense. But I don't think it's the right stuff for professionals to label in the same way. And so there's a complicated tension between where it belongs in one place and where it doesn't belong for others. But his most interesting piece of work, I think, still to this day, is this very short paper in a conference journal called Why Wear Blinkers in a Dark Room for 100 Years Outside. And essentially, I teach this to social workers, and I know Louise, who was in the room, was one of the students who struggled when this got put in the classroom because I tend to do it. But essentially, he's talking about the fact that social scientists have this desperate desire to still practice Newtonian science. And I'm not going to say any more than that. So they practice fixed type science, yes? But really, the science world has moved on to string theory, where everything is blurry and edgy, and it's a much more different world, yet we're still stuck trying to work with the scientific model that the scientists have rejected. And the most beautiful thing that John Booth Davies tells you is, and it's a really desperate thing when I tell social workers this, but it's impossible to do an assessment as a fixed notion on which you should actually be doing someone's care for the next 5 years of their life. It's a conversation you had with them then. Come back 2 weeks later, different person, have the same conversation on the same topic. It's different. It's not fixed or static. Yeah, it's really great paper. And then finally, as a researcher, I was influenced by people who write really well. It's not enough to do the research. You've got to give it back to other people. So for those people who don't know, this is one of the most brilliant ethnographic books written about a village here in northeast Wales, one of the mining villages, Frankenberg. It's the most beautiful piece of writing. But he really encapsulates the difference between how the three different religions interact in the village, how the football does, how the English and Welsh communities mix. It's a lovely piece of writing. And then more recently in the drug and alcohols field, Svenning Sandberg, who's done an awful lot of work with street-based Norwegian cannabis dealers and migrants and stuff. He writes beautifully. So it's really important that you actually write this stuff up really well. And confession to make, I'm really bad at it. I read this stuff and I don't write stuff up really well. Enough to get published at times, but I'm not good. It's a real struggle, and I need a lot of help. Okay, so I thought I'd choose three research examples to say, well, what do I do with all of this? How do I make it into some sense of research? So as Yola rightly said, I've spent a lot of time doing alcohol policy research. Quite a lot of it I've done with my colleague Katie here in the room. And I think what I've increasingly realised is that actually it's important to come at it from lots of different angles. I think that becomes really, really important. We ended up being involved in a piece of work which in the end we did, I can't exactly remember, we did 7 of 9 strands, something like that, Katie, 7 or 10 strands, I don't remember when I quite work it out. Lots of different pieces of research. We ended up interviewing hundreds of people in different contexts. We collected an inordinate amount of data. We did make a recommendation to Welsh Government. I am responsible for people's alcohol, in part, being more expensive. I'm sorry, but I think it's a good thing we don't have over-cheap alcohol in the world. But in the end, I'm still not convinced we actually learned that much concrete that we could really firmly say. What we did do when we wrote up the research was, and this was really interesting, I think, we increasingly used the word messy. We weren't the only ones to talk about the messiness. And it was a requirement for us as researchers to embrace the messiness. Yeah? So there's a lot of headlines that have been associated with the research for minimum price. And minimum price for alcohol, which just says you can't sell it below a certain level, comes out in lots of headlines as this tax on low drinkers, dependent drinkers or anything else. And even that's just a misheading. It kind of assumes that everyone that's got a dependent alcohol problem has no money and can't afford their alcohol. And it's just a false story. If you work in practice, you may see people who are unemployed, you may see people on benefits, you may see people that ruin family income, but you'll also see people come through your door who are GPs. Yes? Yeah? Have plenty of income. And it's not a problem of cost. And then even when we were doing this particular piece of research, we were massively influenced by the fact the first piece of a legislation, you think about controlling the variables. There we are, Katie and I and some colleagues, we've set off to do this piece of research. 3rd of March, 20th of March, or 18th of March, COVID lockdown. Boom. changed everything to do with the way people consume drinks and stuff. It's just a complete red herring that comes in. Yeah? We get out the other end of that, and this is a price-related conversation, and we hit what people refer to as a cost of living crisis. Yes? And you have to try and unpick this stuff, this idea that you can definitively get to it. And there's been quite a lot of claims for this happening in Scotland, quite successfully. We've supported some of that evidence. But at one other core level, yeah, alcohol deaths are still rising in both countries. Yeah, there's no shortage of people working through alcohol and drug treatment agency doors, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that we've been working with, Katie, and please just ignore the blur, the point of this diagram is that we do, in research reports, we now try to capture everything, not even everything, but lots and lots of stuff we think we need to take account of to tell the story, not just one or two bits. So when we're trying to end up telling a research story, we try to take account of everything rather than do the opposite. The traditional scientific method would be to want to take all of this away, say you can control it somehow, remove it all, and actually all you're going to do is consider is the influence of maybe just the bits in the middle, the A, B, C. Did A equal B equal C? And we do a methodology called contribution analysis, and it says exactly what it says on the tin, really. It says exactly what it says on the tin. We attempt to get to the end of this mess, as it were, and say, to what extent is the thing that was planned has actually made a contribution to the things that have been seen? Where are there some correlations rather than claiming causality? This has become really important for me, yes. I've got a really good friend, a colleague of some of ours who's just been doing his PhD. He's an Everton fan. Yeah, you could talk about people in Wrexham, but Everton fans have been miserable for a very long time. They're happy this year. His mood is more affected by what's happening with 11 people on a pitch than almost anything else in life. You don't control that. You don't ask people not to support their football team during a piece of research. So these kind of stuff becomes really important. And then the place where I've really been finishing is, and Yola made reference to it, is I've had the real privilege increasingly of doing what I consider to be participant-led research. So this is just a paper. Everyone, all of these authors here are all individuals with their own lived experience of drug and alcohol research. They were the lead researchers, and I really believe in a process of research where actually the role, and I know Louise in the room has been doing some of this for her PhD, where we actually, as researchers, suggest that maybe some of our role is actually being in, rather than being experts that pile into other people's world and say that we can draw judgments on their world or we can do all that stuff, what we actually do is try and go alongside them and help them increasingly do the research in their own world with the research questions they want that matter to them and stuff. And I think this is really exciting. This is the future for something like this university that wants to talk about inclusivity, has a really big group like Outside In, that celebrates the use of the role of people with lived experience in many of its things. But we are still fighting, as I said earlier, quite a big back catalogue of historical things to get some of this stuff recognised. It's much harder to get this stuff published. But when we get there, it is the best. And why do I say it's the best? Because there was a point in time in which I could hang around in a waiting room in a drug office or an alcohol office to want to collect data. Or I could go on a street area and just go and talk to drinkers. And I had a connection, yeah? Or I had a bit of credibility. That wanes over time. And using others to get at the heart of the conversation, it produces better data, better spaces. It's really important. I can't stress stuff. And again, you get a lot of mentions, but yeah, Katie's really interested in doing a lot of this work as well, so it's great. Yeah, it's really exciting, and it's really important. And I think this is some of the future. And we don't do enough of it. And I've really come to conclusion, if you think about some of the journey I've gone on, that's what we do. So there's some other examples, very briefly, about why we have to really be open to the other stuff. We did some work on prisons, and anyone that's doing work on prisons will increasingly realise, but for alcohol and drug needs, they haven't got an alcohol and drug needs, it's their secondary drug needs. It always points out housing is their number one need. We went and did some research in some homeless hostels, which was about the use of bed centres to reduce cardiac arrests and all sorts of other stuff. There was an implicit assumption that everyone would trust the equipment, and actually the building was full of equipment skeptics, and no one had accounted for this in the research, and it changed the outcome. Casey's been doing a piece of work that's recently been published, but we can't say too much about it. But you remember we were doing one particular instance, and we were just finding out from one particular provider why they couldn't deliver it in one certain place, and they said, there's the wrong fridge in the office. That was the variable that was affecting the outcome and the delivery to the individuals. They had to go every day to their head office to pick up the drug, to drive all the way to another office because they couldn't leave it in the office with the wrong fridge. And it's all these things that you watch out for if you do a different type of research. We did some stuff on medical use of cannabis, and we found out that actually people would break the law for the first time to go and buy cannabis for other family members with chronic illnesses. Wouldn't hesitate, yes? And more recently, I've been doing this work with the World Health Organization, and the single biggest spanner that's changed the whole nature of the research, and it was never on the original plan, was Donald Trump. He's just cut all the funding to WHO, and it's changed the way they work, including the thing we're evaluating. So there are these things, you can't necessarily control them all, and they span other research. What do I think in conclusion? Something like this. My favourite picture of all time, I go to this beautiful place, the Kelvin Grove in Glasgow. It's a museum. It's what Billy Connolly calls the People's Palace. It's not one of those posh, refined museums. It looks like someone's just chucked all sorts of stuff in a chaotic style in a museum. But it has in a secluded corner this beautiful painting by Salvador Dali. And the more you look at it, the more you see. And I think that's some of the stuff that I learned from research. Can we control it? Do we create the data? Or is it out there? I think these are really, really important questions. Can we ever generalise about a whole population samples? When we do that, do we suddenly get into the business of stereotyping and stigmatising the way we draw the conclusions about the research? And I said before, we've got these really big glass ceilings. So I think there's a real need to just be really critical all the time, be open to it, and not think that we've got really firm views. There are lots of things I think we can do differently in research. There are lots of things I'm really uncomfortable with. The example of perhaps why people will do a particular piece of research and then they'll get 15 papers from the one piece of research. They're doing what I call salami slicing it, and they're not necessarily doing it to present a whole story, an accessible story to the wider public. They're doing it to tick the boxes that are required from the university system and their CV. Yes, that is a very typical example. Are we doing the research because we're interested in it? Do we want to make a difference, or are we doing it to support our career? I think we really have to consider about exactly why we're doing the research, who we're doing it for, and what's the point of it. And for me, if we're not doing research in the arena of health and social care that doesn't benefit the individuals that are coming through the doors of health and care social services, why are we doing that research? I'm not saying that that applies, to Richard's and other people's research on a piece of an aeroplane or a piece of carbon or a dirty great big lens in optic. But when we're talking about health, social care and people, if it's not arriving at that, why are we doing it? I think are really, really important questions. And I want to finish, because I know my time's nearly up. I've got a couple of things just to say, finishing really, but I love this. So what have I learned about drug and alcohol? This is one of my all-time favourite quotes. I was determined to find out if there's something better than drinking, but more importantly, something much better than the mundane robotic sobriety. Yes? And the traditional research in our sphere just spends its time in helping people to try to understand how to get off. And it's not what you hear when you work with people in the alcohol and drug arena. The getting off is the relatively easy bit. The staying off is the much harder bit. Yes? And it's this idea, I did not want to just give alcohol up for another version of misery. It's this notion that if you've got four walls and you're subject to a Jeremy Kyle TV programme, we'd probably all rather do it with a glass of wine than without. But actually what we'd like to do is not be in the four walls watching Jeremy Kyle. So it seems pretty straightforward. I know the first one made you smile, Paul, but I'm just beginning to wonder if this also reflects where I'm at in my personal working life as well. So I'm on the eve of retirement and I'm getting out the door. I think what I really wanted to say, though, is that actually being an academic and doing research, and some of the journey I've just tried to give some flavour of, it's an immense privilege. We're really well paid, it's a really nice job, it's a much softer, cushy number than even being a social worker, but certainly working and slaving our way in kitchens and what other people do. And I would just like to see more people embrace the opportunity and do stuff, because it's a great thing to do. It's been really good for me. And what's next? Well, I've thought a lot about this. I will definitely be doing more alcohol research, even though I retire. But I think the balance between that I do, that's to do with research funding and to do with research papers, as opposed to that which I do ethnographically in the community and the culture, will change. And we were in France recently, Mel and I, and we came across this pub in France, and it's called, and I'd already handed these slides in before I could put the picture up, but it's called Academy Bière, yes? And I just thought, that's the home for professors of alcohol and research, yes? So we're off there sometime in the future. So thank you very much.